And for more on China's upcoming summit presidency and topics covered in the G20 in Turkey, I'm joined by Jacob Kirkegaard. He's a senior fellow with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Thank you so much for joining us. So as you just heard, China is next in line. Is it ready to take on this leadership role in the G20?
Well, I think there's no doubt that it will be more challenging for China if the G20s next year continues to be dominated in the way that the current G20 summit has been of international terrorism issues and issues sort of related to the situation in Syria. I think the Chinese government will have prepared and wanted also to focus its G20 presidency much more on global economic issues and really on the need to improve the global economic growth. But of course, events in Paris have pushed that now to the sideline.
Sure, and so it's a matter of still getting some of those topics heard, discussed. President Xi said that he wants to inject new energy into the global economy, wants to focus on new development opportunities. How can they get these things accomplished with these other topics sort of taking the forefront of the discussions?
Well, I think the reality is that it's going to be very difficult because it is the unfortunate nature of terrible tragedies like this weekend in Paris that they will simply force themselves onto the agenda of international gatherings like the G20. And given that, quite frankly, the sort of time and energy of global leaders is finite, that therefore other events and other important issues invariably gets pushed to the side. And I think there is the risk that this will always also be the case during China's presidency of the need to improve global economic growth.
What's your assessment on how the G20 went overall? And what do you see ahead for China, as its economy has slowed down somewhat about, getting some of its points heard, some of its points considered by some of these other leaders? How do you think it went overall?
Well, I think it was a G20 where essentially the main agenda item was injected right at the last minute through the terrorist attacks in Paris. And therefore, it's a G20 that will have had a very different policy focus, not just on the summit itself, but more importantly, probably of all the bilateral meetings on the side of the meetings between the different global leaders. And viewed in that context, I certainly believe that this was a very good G20 summit for Vladimir Putin, because the more important ISIS and global terrorism becomes to the other global leaders, the more important Russia becomes part of the solution to that problem rather than part of the solution rather than part of the problem. So, but this will obviously go directly against the agenda that the Chinese presidency would like to promote next year. But the reality is that there isn't much Beijing can do if these events continue to happen also next year.
You mentioned President Putin. The Russian president says that he has shared Russian intelligence data on the Islamic State financing with some of his G20 colleagues. He says that the terrorists appear to be financed from 40 different countries, including some G20 member states. So where does the group go from here about addressing some of these issues?
Well, I think that there are several levels to the financing issue. One is, of course, the extent to which ISIS is financed directly by contributions by private citizens of other countries. If that's the case, I think it's generally the case that countries like Saudi Arabia or other countries in the Gulf is where the pressure needs to be put to bear. But there's also the issue if ISIS is indeed largely financed through the sale of oil, the sort of illegal or counter, smuggled oil. Well, the main beneficiaries of that trade is almost certainly to be found in the neighboring countries of Syria. That will be Jordan and Turkey. And there, in that case, the main political pressure from the G20 needs to be put on those countries benefiting from the cheap oil sold by ISIS. So it's very important to know the details about financing of ISIS financing, and then the G20 will simply have to allocate its political pressure, which needs to be ratcheted up based on where the money is actually coming from. But this is going to be a major challenge for the G20 also next year.
All right, Jacob Kirkegaard, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, thank you so much for joining us.